coming up on the show.
If we really want to address stigma, we have to name it.
As much as we're going to be able to change with this podcast, it's never going to change. We're never going to be able to change the stigma that people have on drug addicts. We will never be able to change that.
I kind of disagree with you, and here's why.
But here's why I disagree with you.
The first time you used fentanyl, Zoe, why? Why'd you do it? Today's podcast is all about stigma, what it is, how it works, and what we can do about it. Stay tuned at the end of the show to hear Zoe's heartfelt message to her dad. As usual, if you feel activated by anything in today's podcast, reach out and talk to somebody. And if you like what you hear on today's show, like and subscribe.
Okay.
Here we go.
Podcast number 8.
Number 8 already.
Yeah.
Oh my
Is it 8?
God.
I think it's 8. Today we're talking about stigma. Daniel, you're going to kick us off because you've written about stigma. You wrote Monsters, which was about stigma. You wrote other things on stigma. And maybe you can, I don't know, get us started.
Okay, so I'll read something that I wrote. I haven't posted it yet, but this is called Why Stigma. So I'll just read it. Because like you said, I feel unprepared today, but hopefully we end up with a good show.
You know, I feel like that every podcast, it's not just today, it's every podcast we do. I'm like, I don't know what to say. But then it all comes together at the end of it, right?
Somehow it does. It's funny.
Yeah, it's because we have so much to say on it.
Why stigma? A father and daughter team, both using street fentanyl on a daily basis, supporting the other, paying for the other, using with the other. But not always. A few times the father would put some aside for his own use, knowing full well his daughter would suffer because of his theft. Stigma, a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. Disgrace, the loss of reputation or respect as the result of a dishonorable action. So stigma means a person's loss of respect because of a dishonorable action. That's where the stigma of addiction lies. My brother was terrified of the stigma of addiction, so much so that he didn't even talk to me about it, about his dishonorable actions. We were speaking about almost everything during the last year of his life. I was trying to help him. He was trying to avoid those conversations. So the conversation never came. Well, it never came from him. It came from his daughter, Zoe, after his death. She told me of their teamwork. Because of this, Dennis also never came to me and said, Daniel, I need $200 because both me and Zoe are going to start withdrawals and I need to help her. He never once said, I'm trying to taper her down and I give her less than what I use myself. He never once said, I have to use first to make sure the fentanyl is as legit as possible and doesn't kill her. He never once said, I pay more than most because I pay for the good stuff. Thankfully, I knew my brother's character pretty well. Dennis was the most confident person I've ever known. He was soft-spoken. He was very intentional with all things said and done. But that the most confident person I have ever known was essentially embarrassed, not about his actions, but about how his actions would have been perceived by me. Told me something had to change in me if I was going to be of any help to Zoe quitting fentanyl. So obviously this is about Dennis and Zoe and the stigma that Dennis felt about it. And it, that really blew me away because we had really gotten to know each other. in the past year. We grew close. We had our moments. He was opening up more and more, but he would never talk about that. When I think about stigma, that's what I feel. I feel like he didn't talk about it because part of him was really embarrassed about what he was doing, or he was really embarrassed about how people would view his actions. He didn't want to talk about it. That's how I felt.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, what he thought, well, what he perceived as is helping me, other people would perceive that as enabling me, right? But really, at the end of the day, if I wasn't using safe with him, I'd be using unsafe somewhere else, and that's how he looked at it, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the last thing he wanted. He didn't want me being unsafe. He wanted to use before I did to make sure it would be okay. Nobody else would do that.
Yeah.
So he wasn't enabling me. He was just keeping me safe in a way. But other people wouldn't see it like that.
Like, I've been trying not to have these conversations with Zoe for the past months, and it's been really hard because I'm trying to save it for the podcast. Why do you think, Zoe, he never came to me and said those things? Why didn't he tell me about you? That you were using, that you were trying to quit?
Um, Fear, maybe. He knew how you felt about drugs in general.
Yeah.
He knew that, like, being here, I had some type of stability. So he didn't want to jeopardize me being here.
Yeah. I noticed that at the end you guys were spending a lot of time in the room, and he wouldn't come out and watch his shows. He tried really hard not to interfere with my day to day.
Yeah.
I felt like he was doing that on purpose. He didn't want to rock the boat.
Yeah. Out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. But then along with that, I think, yeah, some of it did have to do with embarrassment.
I like that word embarrassment because it's a pretty raw word to use when you attach it to an adult. Embarrassment is usually a characteristic that we apply to kids
Yeah.
going through a certain phase in their life. But it's that embarrassment often that, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Laura, but a lot of the times when someone has embarrassment like that, it's a really raw feeling. It was raw. It was important. It must have been important for Dennis. Otherwise, he wouldn't care. And Dennis was like that a lot. He didn't care about things that didn't matter to him. He was really organized like that. And when I look at it, I really do see, like in that piece I wrote, I mentioned how I'm trying to get him to talk, and he's doing his best to avoid those conversations with me. It always seemed. And those conversations, I think, would have helped him. If he came to me and said those things, it would open doors up for him. He wouldn't have been alone trying to help Zoe. He would have had a team helping Zoe, and he would have had a team helping himself, but he didn't want to talk about it.
You shared that scenario, and and as I'm listening to it, I mean, I'm just going off in all kinds of directions, right? Like, what does this say? What does this mean? Stigma is about perception and how we perceive it, where we go in our thoughts, like what we think this says about him is what stigma is about. And we know that substance use disorders, illicit drug use, it's the most stigmatized health condition in the world because we
That
get caught up
amazing.
in what we think drugs say about a person, what we think it says about you. And so, when I think back to our conversation on safe spaces, if what you think your substance use says about you, is a stigmatized, really negative version of who you are, then you're not going to feel safe enough to talk about it. You're not going to feel like you can share it with others or that others will understand or will even be able to support you in some way. It's been criminalized, right? And so, I think maybe that's why he didn't talk. I mean, I couldn't get him to open very much with me. I always got the sense that he was trying to, he would kind of snicker, right? Like I work in mental health substance use and it felt like a joke when I talked to Dennis. Like I didn't feel like I could say with any authority to him, oh, hey, because he would just look at me and Laura, you don't get it. And I knew he was right.
I can picture my dad when you just said that. Like I picture him in front of you saying, you just don't get it. I can see him, like I can see his facial expressions. I can see his body language. I can see him when you explain that.
Yeah.
So why was he afraid? Do we even want to know? Do we want to know, and do we want to talk about it? Do we want to let other people know that these are the things that you should be talking about? Because, I mean, I don't know if I came across, but when you stop talking about it, you're closing your own doors. And when you talk about it, you're opening doors that will lead you to help.
But I think it also depends on how we talk about it. Think about language. And I was hoping that at some point today we would talk about language, because language can evoke different types of stigmatizing attitudes, like how we talk about things. Like for example, and on the last podcast, I read junkies. And I've talked to you about like how uncomfortable I feel even using that word. And Daniel and I have talked about it because he's like, well, but that's what it is. And when I read that blog on junkies, it was very good for me to read it. Because, I could be all PC about it and say, oh, person's struggling with a substance use disorder. But if we really want to address stigma, we have to name it and we have to see it for what it is. Because we can change the way we language things, but until we really unpack it and understand what is it that keeps these conversations difficult to have. I don't think I made it, even with all my clinical skills, I don't think I was ever all that successful in creating a safe space for Dennis, because every time he got onto the phone with me, he was trying to unhinge from the conversation. He didn't want to have the conversation. I almost got the sense that he was trying to protect me from the conversation. So instead, he would tell me that he was in control and that everything was going to be okay and that he knew what he was doing. And it was kind of like, and it meant that I didn't have to take it on.
That burden was not your burden to take on, almost in a sense, in his eyes.
Exactly.
He didn't want you to take that on.
Yeah. And yet, if to have done this better would have been to say, I can take the burden, share it with me. Tell me how I'm failing
on both of us.
Yeah. Tell me how I can really help. Or, can it be okay for me to challenge you a little bit, or for us to talk about things that feel difficult? Or if I had said to him, hey, I don't think this says anything terrible about you. I think you're just a person doing the best you can and trying to figure it out. And maybe this is what's been working the best for you so far. If I could maybe have removed, that perception of, whatever he thought that this said about him, maybe that would have made it different.
So if someone's out there listening right now and they're in Dennis's shoes, and we're talking about whether to talk or not, whether to ask for help from somebody or not, what do we tell them?
I think that we can all do better if we're aware of stigma and how it works. I think we can all take some kind of ownership in what we will do.
You know why I like that? I like that because it puts the burden of responsibility on society rather than on the person with addiction.
The first place I go to is language. I feel like language is incredibly powerful. And so if we think about, like you said, taking responsibility of what we can do to destigmatize, right? Or to let other people know that we're aware of stigma. I think how we talk about people, the language we use shapes, how we are invited to think about it and how we're invited to feel about it. It has to begin with us, right? Like oftentimes when somebody's struggling with a substance use disorder, we lean in like, hey, you need help. And, how can I help you? And then that's layered in stigma. And so I think it does begin with us, right? It begins with us thinking about like what do we think about it? That
Yeah.
scenario that you read, it evokes a lot of thoughts and feelings about what does it mean to be a good parent? What does it mean to be a good dad? Do dads do this, for daughters? Is this appropriate?
Right.
Um, what
Yeah.
does
And
this say about you as a person?
yeah.
Um, so what I feel is so powerful about that, that scenario that you shared is that it does evoke a lot. And I think if we are going to have conversations about stigma, you know, we can have very safe conversations about stigma and we can go through lists and lists of appropriate language. We can also unpack that this is really complex. And it means that we have to evaluate um, how we think about these things, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And specifically, how do you think about a father and daughter both using together? I, you know, shit happens. Sometimes you end up in this situation and it doesn't necessarily make you a bad father. That was one of the things Dennis didn't want the rest of his family to know. He didn't want them to know because it just makes him a bad dad. How do you help someone like that? How do you help a father-daughter team like that? What do you do? There's a whole segment of society that literally falls back to survival of the fittest. Hey, some people don't make it. And those are the people that don't deserve to make it. It's just natural selection. Like people really feel that way. Have you ever had a conversation where someone has said, well, you know what? The sooner they die, the better?
I wonder if maybe statements like that have a lot to do with fear. It's an easier response than to feel all of it and to feel ambivalent about it and to feel scared because you don't know how to help or what to do. If we choose to do something else, if we choose to accept that stigma matters, that that people who use substances and those that are struggling with addiction face discrimination and barriers. If we choose to see it that way, then we have to accept that we are creating those barriers. That when somebody doesn't share, when somebody's avoiding to get help, it's because maybe they're afraid of judgment and they're afraid of getting into trouble, whether that's with their families, their loved ones, their workplaces, the law. Um,
Yeah.
maybe this is why maybe these are the good reasons to hide substance use, hide your drug use. Maybe these become the good reasons to use alone. Maybe, and maybe this is also, and we're here to talk about these three perspectives, right? The lived experience, the caregiving experience, and the service industry, the healthcare industry. And, maybe this also contributes to why people that are struggling in their substance use are also not always able to connect well to services or to even have the quality of care in healthcare systems happen for them. Like it's multi-pronged. I mean, it impacts all of these areas. And so, we talk about somebody who's shut down and not sharing. If we begin to look at it that way, it's like, yeah, of course you shut down. Of course you stop sharing. And suddenly the world doesn't look like a very safe, warm, and loving place.
Hey, Zoe, do you remember being stigmatized?
Um, yeah, of course. Everybody has an outlook on you. Um, Even people who don't know, they know. You can tell when a person uses. You can tell. I can tell. You just it's horrible, but regardless, I don't think, as much as we're going to be able to change with this podcast and talking about it and opening doors that people are scared to talk about and stuff like that, like it's never going to change. We're never going to be able to change the stigma that people have on drug addicts. We will never be able to change that, no matter how hard we try. Like, at the end of the day, if a drug addict walks into a store they're going to be judged on their appearance. They're going to be the one that the store owner is going to be watching rather than the person with the Gucci purse. You know what I'm saying? Like we're never going to be able to change that. No matter how much we talk about it, it's never going to change. And it sucks, because not all drug addicts are bad people and not all non-drug addicts are good people. Like,
Well, you know what? I kind of disagree with you, and here's why. 10 years ago, anxiety and depression were shunned upon too. Campaign comes out from Bell Canada, and that campaign was so successful. I saw it everywhere. And now 10 years later, everybody is talking about depression and anxiety. Everybody has it.
But here's why I disagree with you, because walking into a store, is a person with anxiety or depression more likely to steal? No. But a person with a drug addiction, is that person more likely to steal? Yes.
Yeah.
So I disagree with you. People are always going to stigmatize people with addiction because they need money in order to support their habit. So if they have money, cool. But if they don't, they're going to do anything by any means to get money in order to support that habit.
So, what's interesting about what you just said is addiction is not a choice.
Right.
Do you agree?
I don't believe it's a choice. No.
Yeah, because there's this common misconception that addiction is a choice. And so in that scenario, it's kind of like, hey, the shopkeeper sees somebody come in and it's like pretty clear that they're using substances, and based on what they're perceiving in this situation, they're like, nope, this is a high risk person, they're going to steal from me. But if we see addiction as a choice, then we tend to apply more of a punitive sort of like, this is a choice, you don't have to choose to do this.
Right.
But if we look at substance use disorder as a healthcare issue, that if we look at it as addiction being complex, and that people develop addictions for many complex reasons, and that maybe this isn't a choice, maybe this isn't something that they want, it immediately begins to soften it a little bit. It's not that we're giving them an out. It's not saying, hey, yeah, you get to steal or you get to,
right.
But it is about softening the perception of what we see happening here.
And I'm not going to be the devil's advocate on this one, but a lot of people disagree with that, right? They really do feel like it's a choice. Like the first time you used fentanyl, Zoe, why'd you do it?
I don't think anybody goes in, thinking, hey, I'm going to do this and I'm going to fucking end up doing this for the next 10 years of my life. Nobody goes in thinking like that. People go into, what I'm saying, for a night to party or you know what I'm saying, to numb something that, like something terrible that happened, but they're not expecting for it to become such a big thing, such an addiction in their life. They're not anticipating that. They're not trying to get to that point, and before you know it, you're there and you're stuck. Like, it happens so fast. Like, you take, what I'm saying, you use for 3 or 4 days. By the 5th day, if you're not using, you feel like shit, and it happens way before you even realize it's happening. It happens literally in the snap of your fingers. Like, you don't even realize what's happening while you're using, like, day after day. You don't even realize it's been a week that you've been using solid, and then you're fucked. Like, it's not something that you set out to do, that you plan to do, that it's not something that you want for the next 10 years of your life, if not more. You don't want it. It's never a plan to fucking get addicted to something or ruin your fucking life because of it. That's never the plan for anybody.
Well, looking back, because you talked about how well fentanyl worked, right? And once you tried it, it worked better than other things.
Yeah.
Do you remember what it was helping you with at that time? Because, and the reason why I ask is this notion that addiction is not a choice, right? If we were to kind of tackle this misconception that addiction is a choice, that just a dumb decision, you didn't have to do that. If we were to look more at addiction being complex, then it invites that, hey, maybe there are some factors, maybe there are some reasons under which a person uses fentanyl. Do you remember back then what was going on that, and you can only, I mean, go into as much detail as you want. But were there things happening in your life that you wanted to numb out from?
Well, I was using opiates prior to starting to use fentanyl, and like a lot happened, like my mom was raped when I was 12, and I was there when she came home, and that really fucked with me. After that, I kind of became the adult, and I took care of my mom, and like I kind of did the shopping for groceries, and she couldn't leave the house, and I stayed home from school to be with her because she was scared to be alone. Like, I took on that role at a really early age. And I don't blame my mom for it by all means. She went through something super traumatic. I couldn't even imagine going through something like that. Um, but I just kind of, I guess, grew up, right? Really, really fast when that happened. And then um, I lost my best friend to an overdose, and then that's when I started using a lot more. And then that's when I had tried fentanyl for the first time, and it kind of just numbed out everything that was a constant, like on constant repeat in my mind. Things that kept me up at night, I was able to sleep, right? um Bad thoughts would just be erased, like I didn't think about it. Even when it came to like bad dreams, like I had a lot of very vivid vivid bad dreams, and it kind of just took that all away. I was able to live and feel normal. I was able to get up and clean my house and take care of my kids, and be a mom and get shit done, and it was kind of a way to deal with my depression, to deal with my anxiety, to deal with traumatic things that happened to me. Just bad scenarios, right? I was just able to deal with life on life's terms, right?
Mhm. So then using fentanyl becomes a way to manage trauma,
Yeah,
chronic stress, um, emotions, thoughts, feelings.
yeah, depression.
Fentanyl
Yeah,
becomes a way to help yourself so you can
yeah,
function.
yeah.
And like you said, you're not going into it thinking, oh, this is going to mess me up for years. This is the solution.
When you first start using, it's a solution to everything.
Yeah.
It's not the problem, it's literally the solution to everything that's not okay in your life.
Yeah. You see, I think your story and what you're sharing um, helps understand, you know, how to unpack stigma.
Mhm.
Like there's a story behind everything. And so sometimes these stigmatizing statements about people, they don't allow for those stories to come out. They don't allow for us to get close and personal with people's experiences to understand what's underneath it. And
Right.
so instead, we kind of fall back on blanket statements and language that kind of, is punitive, right? It there's not a lot of empathy there. There's not a lot of understanding or a lot of insight, deeper insight into like, okay, well, where did this come from and how did this start and what maintained it?
Yeah.
Um,
And then, before you know it, that solution that was dealing with all of your problems now becomes the problem, right? So it it helps deal with all these negative things in your life. They make them better. And then the addiction sets in because you continue using to continue to have all these good feelings and kind of push away the negative feelings. And then that solution to all your problems becomes the main problem before you realize it. And then once that happens, then everything becomes just an even bigger problem because your solution is now the problem. So everything that you were numbing out and trying to escape from is now there, plus another big problem that you need to deal with, right? Because it only, don't get me wrong, it numbs out things for as long as you want it to. But when you start to change your outlook and your mind on things, it kind of it almost doesn't work anymore because you create a pain in you that was never there before, 10 times as bad. The anxiety that you were numbing out, it becomes 10 times as bad because now you're anxious about not having uh, the substance to use in order to take away what you're trying to take away or run away from. So the anxiety just gets amplified, the depression gets amplified, all of your problems become amplified. It only works for so long before it gets worse. Like it does, it's like putting a band-aid over something. You're not really dealing with any of your issues, you're just covering them up.
as you describe it that way, I can really see how it starts to close in.
Yeah.
I mean, geez, the first thing I want to ask you, Zoe, is the reason why you started with opioids. Is that still here today? All those things that were stressing you out and numbing you out and you wanted to numb out from, how are you dealing with those things today? That's an activating question right there.
Yeah, honestly, I don't even know how to answer that right now. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. I know the hardships I've been through. I know the shitty place that I was at. And I think just knowing where I was before keeps me on this side of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, just knowing how fucked up everything was before and how hard it was and just how sad it was keeps me on this side.
So you had almost an epiphany about life.
Mm-hmm. I believe so, yeah.
Yeah.
I
Wow.
never want to go through that again, no matter what life throws at me right now. I'd rather deal with it than ever have to deal with that shit ever again. I don't ever want to be back there. It's a place where very few people escape from.
I remember walking into pharmacy and asking for help with Zoe and feeling stigma from them. And they would pull me aside and say, look, there's only so much you can do for her. You can't change anything here. It's going to have to be her decision. And I mean, looking back at it, I'm like, God, the nerve to think that I would actually go to a pharmacy without thinking about those three things first. It's her decision. It's her choice. I mean, those are funny first words to say to someone that asks for help in this situation.
As you say that, this is said a lot. I mean, I work in mental health substance use, and one of the criteria to accessing some kind of help is the desire to want help. So in other words, help is voluntary. Like it's a voluntary agreement. It means that the person has to say, not only do they have to say, hey, I'm using substances and it's causing a problem and I don't like it anymore and I want some help, they also have to volunteer for the help that they're going to receive. And I don't know if everybody who wants help is in a space to do that. What do you think?
Well, my first question is, what do you do for the people that don't want that help? What do you do for them?
Well, what we do for them is a lot, actually. We say to people, if you change your mind, this is a safe space. We try to create safe spaces. Part of creating a safe space is offering harm reduction. Harm reduction is whatever and anything that will reduce risk. So for somebody using opioids, it might be to ensure that they have an Narcan kit. It might be to ensure that their friends have them too. It might be to have conversations about how to use safely or not alone. It might be offering some support services that they may or may not want at this time. It
So
may be
you keep the lines of communication open when someone says to you, look, I don't really want help right now.
absolutely. Now,
That's
that's
so
not,
amazing.
well, that's not all services. There are many services, and it wasn't, and it was, and still today, there are services that will say, hey, clean up your addiction, deal with that
Yeah.
first, manage your
And
substance use disorder, and then come and start counseling or some, so there's a lot of models, abstinence-based models that are either about, you cannot be using to be in the program, or in order to get into the program, you can't be using. And that's tricky.
now there's people out there that say, you're goddamn right, I'm not going to help them. First of all, they don't want to be helped. And what I say to that is, every time I walk through the store, I see these people sleeping in the alleyways or standing outside bugging people for money. I don't want that. I don't want that in my neighborhood. So what I would like to know is, how do you combat stigma? Like, if I could go back in time 8 months and be walking down the street with my brother, how would I combat stigma in that point? What would I do different? What would the guy in the grocery store do different? What would the guy in the pharmacy, what would his methadone doctor do different? If we could all tell them, hey, there's this thing called stigma, and it's really screwing people up. It's really having an effect on them.
What do you mean? Like what they could do different rather than being judgmental the way they've been? Or
Yeah.
like,
Because everybody knows not to be judgmental, but that statement has never changed a thing
right,
anywhere. People
everybody's
are
judgy and
judgmental.
yeah, of course. Even if
Everybody
they don't
is.
say it, they're thinking it.
What if the idea that addiction is a treatable medical condition, not a choice?
Yeah.
If we agreed to look through that lens, then that might also invite that, hey, individuals' level of readiness might look a little different. Like, not everybody feels like, okay, this is a good time for me to take this on, or they might be so steeped in their substance use disorder that they don't see what other people are seeing. But maybe if, the approach was to look at addiction as treatable, as a healthcare issue, then maybe that would invite more compassion, and just more positive attitudes about how we help and support people that are struggling
So
rather
how would we
than,
change that though? What could we do?
I mean, maybe it starts, it starts with getting that message out. It starts by living that message.
I like the commercial that has an old man in a shelter and people walking past them. And then someone walks past them, that old man turns into a little baby. And all of a sudden, people stop and help.
Mm.
Oh,
I
wow.
love that commercial because it reminds you that everyone
Mhm.
has that story. Everyone has a story that's,
Yeah, that's
very Yeah.
true.
We can't really understand stigma unless we invite the complexity,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. A lot of people, like, and this is just what I think, a lot of people that, what got me here was the traumatic things that happened in my life, what got me to that place. Having my dad pass away, I should have, wound up worse off than I started. You know what I'm saying? Because that's what made me start using drugs in the first place, was traumatic things. And honestly, losing my dad, I think, is one of the most traumatic things that has ever happened to me. I took what could have been my life in scrambles, and still being an active user and possibly being worse in my addiction than I ever was, and I turned that into sobriety and positivity and doing something with my life and making the change for the better,
yeah,
when in
and
reality it could have went the complete opposite way.
yeah.
Zoe, do you think that, and I know this sounds loaded. There's a part of me that wants to hear that maybe that process started with your dad.
No, they were like,
Did it?
it was my dad. Honestly, like, yes, I have kids, yes, I have family that loves me, but nothing made me change my life more than my dad
Mhm.
passing away. Nothing.
But leading up to his death, was it moving in that direction or not?
No,
No.
no,
Yeah.
it wasn't. I said it was so many times. I pledged it to other people. I almost made it sound believable, but in reality, no, I was not planning on stop. Like, I wasn't trying to stop using. I wasn't trying to change my life. I just wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I probably wouldn't have had that never happen, which brings me to kind of the outro that I have written. Um, it has to do along those lines.
Go for it.
Do it.
So we're ready for our outro.
Yeah.
All right. So, I'm angry with myself. I'm frustrated because I don't think it's fair that I'm all pro help people now, but I wasn't that person for my dad. I was just worried about my next fix, making sure I wasn't sick. I didn't care or see how bad I wasn't only hurting myself, but the position I was putting my dad in. I wasn't fair to you, Dad, and I'm sorry. I wish I could change things. I wish I could go back in time and just try to get better and help you get better. Maybe things would have been different. Maybe you would still be here. Maybe my actions trying to get better and clean would have influenced you to do the same with me. Are you not here because you couldn't take on my habit, my burden? Was it too much? Too much to see every day? Was it too difficult? Are you not here because you couldn't take on my habit, my burden? Was it too much to handle? Too much to see every day? Was it too difficult to see that I was just like you, so much like you?
Part of me feels like you died so that I could live. I don't know how to feel about it or deal with it. I try not to think about it, but I do. I think about it every day. All the what ifs and all the maybes. Sometimes I just feel like laying here and screaming when I think about all the shit that I can't change. I think the only thing that keeps me going is knowing how proud you are of me and everything I've accomplished this far. And that is one of the best feelings I have now.